Okay, in this segment, we're continuing on with some system properties. And I want to talk about self-organizing systems, self-organization as a system property. I'm just looking at this and I realized disturbance is not always thought of as a system property, but I've included it in this segment. So self-organization. Again, we have human and non-human systems that we're talking about. And one of the things that it was actually in the Hall Smith reading that made me think I needed to talk a little bit about self-organization. So the overall concept is that complex systems are typically self-organized. So in most complex systems, you don't have a big boss telling anyone what to do. Even in really hierarchical organizations, you'll often have something like a strategic plan that allows the different elements of that system to organize for essentially the same purpose, but they're self-organizing. So the linkages in the system, those boxes and arrows, function at different ways and different scales, different parts of the systems. But the coherence of the system comes from its overall purpose. And then anyone who is participating in that overall purpose or in that system typically self-organizes their participation. Now, in the Hall Smith reading, Hall Smith says that order will emerge in an evolutionary self-organizing manner and that it cannot be imposed through hierarchical control or external force. Now, I don't really think that is all true. I think it's partly true, but I don't think it's all true. Because I think there are systems that impose hierarchical control for the system's purpose. And I think there are external forces that organize systems. So those things do exist. And so the reason I pull this out is because whenever there's a confusion between what's descriptive and what's normative, I like to point that out because I think it's a bad habit to talk about norms, whether they're moral or aesthetic or whatever. I think it's a mistake to talk about norms as if they were descriptive. So it's morally true that order in human systems should not be imposed through hierarchical control or external force. There should be a process of agreement or signing on or something that is morally relevant to our humanity. And that is a moral. I know that the word moral makes some people like itchy, but we do have some morality as part of our Western liberal cultural heritage. Democracy is based on that morality. And so I think it's important to point out when we have these sort of more or less shared moral stances. And it's, also it's reflected in a certain level of international consensus that this is morally true, that order should not be imposed, but rather should be self-organized. So in human systems, it is descriptively true to assume that people will self-organize. And it's, of course, morally more desirable, morally from the point of view of your being as a human, more desirable to live in systems where people are making choices. And it is also, we all know, if you read about how people act in systems of highly hierarchical or autocratic systems, people still strategize and choose their own responses about how they're going to respond. You know, people do. Anyway, that's enough of the morality for the moment. Self-organizing systems are indeed where the elements, which is you and me or businesses or any different parts of the system you're looking at, establish their own relationships, whether those are economic relationships, you know, and they do these things in pursuit of this shared system purpose. So the clearest examples of how systems self-organize are usually after a disturbance. So for example, you might have an existing transportation system of roads, but after an avalanche, you'll have people form little groups and start organizing transportation past, you know, around the avalanche by boat, for example, so that people can get to emergency services. And this brings us to this idea of a disturbance. And most of us just know from our Ecology 101 that a disturbance is something that goes through and breaks up a set of system relationships. So in ecology, it might be something that breaks roots, or something that kills a dominant species, or something that changes the order of the relationships. So if we're thinking with systems and human community systems, we can think of disturbances as hurricane, and we could think of the pandemic itself as a disturbance, either to our regular way of conducting our social relationships before they were all on the keyboard, or we can think of a pandemic as disturbing our economic relationships. It's disturbed supply chains. It's been a disturbance to those kinds of systems. And it's been a disturbance, as far as I can tell, it's been a disturbance to how people generally do their household food planning. The reason I say that is because everyone's out of canning jar lids. And to me, that means there must be more people than usual canning this season. And we have a bit of a delay in the deliveries of wide mouth and narrow mouth jar lids. So, but not everything that makes a change is a disturbance. And so that's why I like to think about the idea of wildfire. Now, I'm in a part of BC where we have dreadful air quality right now because of the wildfires in the United States. I noticed it's not as bad in Prince George, which makes me a little bit jealous. So wildfire is just a really good example of something that's sometimes a disturbance, and it's sometimes a part of the system that helps the system keep its identity. So if you sort of think about that, when is a wildfire a disturbance, and when is a wildfire part of the system feedback or an element of the system? And so for me, is this thing, in this case wildfire, is it predictable and regular? If it's predictable and regular, it's more likely part of the system. If it's necessary in order for the system to retain its identity, it is definitely part of the system. So if you think about, I'm trying to think of the forests around Burns Lake. They are, well, right now there is a lot of, it seems to me, jack pine, lodgepole pine forests. And well, that's a really good example. Lodgepole pine forest is a system that requires wildfire because the cones of that tree won't actually release their seeds unless there is a wildfire. So that's like a wildfire ecology. So when wildfire comes through that kind of forest, from the point of view of that forest system, that's not a disturbance. It's an element of the system, because it is necessary for that system to keep being a lodgepole pine forest. And if you didn't have the wildfire, it would become something else over time. Or is the thing that happens not essential for the system to retain its identity or purpose, or even breaks or affects the coherence of the system? And right now, I'd say that well, wildfire in towns is not doesn't help the towns retain coherence. I just can't believe I didn't put that. But to me, a wildfire in a wildfire ecology system is part of the system. A wildfire in a town is a disturbance. Climate changes, like we're seeing, so we have that increased level of wildfire in our wildlands, a greater percentage of the forest burnt each year. That is going to change the identity of the ecological system, change the way it works. And so in that way, climate change related increased wildfire intensity is functioning as a disturbance in ecological terms, even in the wildfire ecology systems. You have that relatively new fire intensity where the soil becomes infertile for decades. That's a system change, because it's going to change what lives in the ecosystem. So when you're looking at a human system and thinking about whether or not something is a disturbance or part of the system, which, surprise, we're going to do in the next lecture segment, that to me is the key question. Is it essential for the system to retain its identity for this kind of thing to happen, or is it predictable? Or those are the key questions. Okay, so coming up, an example of all of these concepts